the Honourable Philip Gardiner. And before the member begins, can I just remind members that it is the member's inaugural speech and the usual courtesies should be followed. The Honourable Philip Gardiner.
Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, honourable members, and I acknowledge the traditional ownership of the Noongars whose ground I stand on. It is my privilege to have you here while I make this my first address in this chamber. As I was crossing the crosswalk approaching Parliament House this morning, on the top southwest corner, I think it's over there, of the building were two kookaburras, belting out the strongest laughs you could have hoped to have heard. I thought, is this an omen? Because I am making a speech which is not going to be 90% presentation and 10% content, of which most speeches, good speeches, are made. This speech will be the opposite, and I request your indulgence. For me, politics is not an end game in itself. Instead, like business, where with hard work, profits fall out the bottom if the business strategy and implementation is sound, my goal of politics is to advance the interests issue by issue for the people of Western Australia. This was the oath which I have made in the presence of the Governor and Upper House colleagues. If this can be done with honesty, fairness and equity, the benefit to our state and country will similarly emerge. I am here because of the ruthless exercise of democratic power, to achieve a political balance of power which has placed me in a position where I can assist in making a difference. Even in my absence, physical absence, this difference has begun to be made. It will particularly benefit regional Western Australia, from where the bulk, as we all know, the 37% of Western Australia's contribution of Australian exports originate. It is rewarding because I agreed to Brendan Grills's request to stand as number 2 on the National Agricultural Region Upper House ticket on the outside possibility that the party could achieve gaining the balance of power. History records the outcome and the positive consequences to date. But the dilapidated plight of regional Western Australia became evident to me in the course of my campaign for the federal seat of O'Connor, which encompassed most of the regional agricultural Western Australia during the federal 2007 election. Now this region, which I've expanded a little bit now because it extends from basically Kalbarri in the north to Albany in the south, from the Indian Ocean at north of Cervantes in the west to Mullawar, Merredin, Lake King, Hopeton in the east. It struck me most objectively on the Friday before the federal election, when I was reading the Western Australian and I noticed the list of polling booths in O'Connor, and there were 2.5 columns of them. And I thought, that's a lot, but Kalgoorlie would probably be more, and Kalgoorlie was only 1.5 columns, and all the other electorates in this state were less. The interesting thing about polling booths is that they are located in towns and suburbs which each require basically the same social and physical infrastructure, be it primary schools, pools, sporting grounds and so on. Not everyone, not all of them, but most. And so when I got back to Moora that evening, I looked in the Electoral Commission report and I found, to check what the other electorate polling booths were. And to my surprise, O'Connor had 17.5% more polling booths than any other electorate in the country. The relevance of this is that the incumbent was saying how we were doing so well by getting 4th highest expenditure for this and 10th for that and so on, which I thought was pretty good too. But that regional part of Western Australia was being underdone because we should have been having 17.5% more than any other electorate. This was the clearest factual base which supported the hearsay impression which I had gathered as I was campaigning and door-knocking throughout the O'Connor electorate. Their royalty for region strategy, to which I had already been privy, was not a stunt. It was genuine and very much needed. Being raised in a farming family in the country in a regional district such as Moora, community self-help permeates the value system which is so critical to the survival and growth of country communities. My late father, Warren Gardiner, was an ex-serviceman of World War II. He was denied a proper education following his father being unfairly hit by the effects of the Depression when the partner in his firm left him with all the debts. With the support of his wife Lillian Nee Kingston, now called Betty, who took the brave road of leaving the city for the isolation yet strong community of the country, my parents were determined that their two children had the education he missed. As a consequence, they commenced their son's primary education at Moora and then at Guildford Grammar School for their secondary schooling. They didn't have any material equity, yet they were able to buy Noondime, which was part of the original Gardiner land taken up as early settlers of Moora, from my father's uncle against 100% vendor finance, very generously given. Live reasonably comfortably, send two boys to board at a private school, and support one at university, all the while holding their family firmly together. Real incomes in agriculture were different then. Very difficult to achieve that from agriculture now, without further adding seriously to debt. My father's grandfather, James Gardiner, served as a member of the West Australian Parliament during the early 1900s, first as colonial treasurer in the Sir Walter James's government in 1902. In 1913, and I was pleased to have this confirmed tonight by Mr. Del O'Connor, he became the first parliamentary leader, Deirdre Wilmot, Wilmot. He became the first parliamentary leader of the Country Party, the predecessor of the Nationals of anywhere in Australia. His parliamentary record included a short period as Speaker of the Lower House in 1917, before resigning due to his own deteriorating health and that of his wife. Reading some of his speeches in Hansard recently, I trust that I can serve with the valour and honesty which he brought to the Parliament in the interests of the people of Western Australia. My brother Colin, after a distinguished school career at Guildford Grammar School, forsook a scholarship to the University of WA to return to the family farm at Moora, where he farms today. Each of us face different forks in the road we traverse as part of life, as we have heard from those who have made their first speeches already. Allow me to give you a little of my background, then I'll briefly address 5 topics: the role of the upper house, the relevance of regional Western Australia, regional social infrastructure needs, rural crime and family dysfunction, and climate dynamics and agriculture. Having graduated from Guildford Grammar School in 1964, I was fortunate to receive scholarships to undertake agricultural science at the University of Western Australia, where I completed agricultural economics in 1969. During this time, I was also fortunate to have been a resident at St George's College, with a number of current parliamentary colleagues, and a playing member of the University Football Club during a particularly distinguished period of its history. Having been educated this far, I felt that it would be a waste to return to farming forthwith. So following graduation in 1969, I obtained a trainee position as a programmer in training, that's computer programming, with the Commonwealth Department of Trade and Industry in Canberra. But this path was cut short when I was awarded a Rotary Graduate Fellowship, which allowed me to attend Harvard's European Centre at the time, the l'Institut pour les méthodes de direction de l'entreprise in French-speaking Switzerland, acronym known as IMEDE, in Lausanne. And there I completed a Master of Business Administration in 1972. It was here I found another serious fork in the road. A research associate then at IMEDE, an Australian, asked me after 3 to 4 months of the program what I was thinking of doing after completion. We have been doing case studies about cost control, cost accounting, which I found concise, compartmentalised, and important for managing a business. So I said cost accounting. With some dismay, he said I should consider finance, about which I knew virtually nothing. I began investigating this subject area. As a consequence, it was there that I learned about the basics and some of the intricacies of the foreign exchange market and banking principles. I'll never forget the occasion of the discovery that the calculation of forward exchange rates had nothing to do with exchange rate expectations. It was all to do with mathematical differences between interest rates of the currencies involved. Returning home to Moora at the end of 1972, I proceeded to apply for positions in merchant banks, as these non-bank organisations were then termed, after the British model. The best I got was from a Citibank offshoot in Sydney, who said to me over the telephone, I'm at Moora at this stage, next time you're in Sydney, call in for an interview. This I did, and it was my good fortune to procure a trainee marketing officer position. The real implication of telling you about this is that while out talking to a prospective client in 1974 in Sydney, he asked about a new transaction structure for covering the foreign exchange exposure of non-trade items. Because the market was extremely regulated in those days, the Reserve Bank took all the net risk from the trading banks, and the banks had a very easy time, but capital commitments could not be covered. My education and research about foreign exchange all came home to roost. However, this time it became frustrated by a senior executive at City National who declined to spend on senior legal opinion to clear the way through a real maze. It was the maze of the Reserve Bank's authorisation letter, the Commonwealth's Insurance Act, the Gaming and Betting Act of New South Wales, and the Stamp Duties Act of New South Wales. But it was clear to me that foreign exchange was neither insurance nor gaming and betting in that defined sense. Similarly resiling from this perception were two firms which I had learned about from my English brother-in-law, G.H. Mitchell & Sons, the wool broker and wool top manufacturer in Adelaide, and Mears & Phillips, a former medium-sized stockbroker in Sydney. They hired me. We found the legal way through, and we developed a sustainable hedge contract document based on a mix of language and law prepared by well-known Sydney lawyer Aleko Varsakis and his assistant, now Justice Robert McFarlane. This currency hedge market developed well in Australia between 1975 and 1978. At this time, Mears Mitchell Elders, as the firm had become, and I separated over what I felt was an ethical issue. And I was fortunate that merchant banks had now recognised that currency hedging was a valid instrument for corporations to manage their exchange risk. In early 1978, I accepted an offer from Hill Samuel Australia Limited, becoming a director in 1981. In 1985, when Hill Samuel became Macquarie Bank, I was a founding director of the main board. At Macquarie, I've had the privilege of working with many fine people. I remained on the board until 1994, well after having returned to farm at Moora some 6 years earlier. It was an experience where we had taken on the large Australian commercial banks. The Australian dollar had become a part of the world's foreign exchange market, giving Australia's exporters and importers, foreign currency borrowers and Australian investors with overseas assets the ability to manage their foreign exchange risks. Had assisted my friend and colleague Clive Carroll build the bullion and gold arbitrage market in Australia and overseas, and played a collective part building the Hill Samuel Macquarie culture. It had been a career accident, but a good one. In 1988, I was back to doing what I most enjoyed, the challenge of one of the most difficult professions, farming grain and sheep for wool, as well as sheep breeding. I continued Eastern States Board involvement for a further 10 years, with midnight flights at times up to 3 in a week, but outside the system, I was losing touch, and in the end, it just became too difficult. The relevance of the upper house of the West Australian Parliament. There have been times I have watched political proceedings where I have despaired at what I had identified as democratic dictatorship, where the executive had become so strong and party discipline so complete that I felt there was a political failure in the essential principles of democracy. I have also despaired with the party lines along which much of the upper houses of Parliament across the country operate. I am aware of frustrations felt by members of the lower house when the composition of upper houses cause simplistic political obstructionism and power plays rather than working to make effective, sound law from the bills submitted. Rigid party discipline applying to the upper house defeats the purpose of that chamber. I commend all parliamentarians to read the recent book published by the University of WA Press titled Restrained Elective Dictatorship, the Upper House Solution by Aroni, Pricer and Nethercote. One commentator, James Madison, wrote, quote, "When the legislation is unified, it wields a dominant, unbalanced power over the other branches of government," unquote. This is too dangerous for true democracy. I am committed to the upper house being a house of review which can both work openly with legislative framers in the lower house and make independent judgment to bring effective law to the people of Western Australia to enhance their lives. The relevance of regional Western Australia. How relevant is regional Western Australia to the state and the country? Regional Western Australia contributes around 23% of the state's economy, but 90% of the state's and 37% of the country's foreign exchange earnings. Now, without foreign exchange earnings, the state and the country could not afford the consumer and capital imports which underpins Western Australia's and Australia's standard of living. And these Western Australian foreign exchange earnings are at a level much higher per head than any other part of the country. The relevance of regional Western Australia to the state has, especially since the election of September 7, become more recognised by all, with increasing awareness of its economic relevance. This economic relevance is not only important to Western Australia, it's just as important for Australia. Like the Royalties for Region strategy, it is important to the citizens of Western Australia that the state receive a true share of the tax distribution from national revenue collections under our federal system. This has been a difficult realisation to achieve over a number of state governments, but it was gratifying when the Gallop-led state government and Ripper-led state treasury negotiated an additional nearly $250 million distribution to the state with a Liberal-led federal government. I know that there is significantly more work to be done in this area and that Treasurer Buswell is pursuing this with renewed vigour, and I shall try and give him every support. How much of this output revenue contributes to net wealth in regional Western Australia? Not a lot. Despite the mining company contributions, mining revenue mostly flows out of the regions, exacerbated by fly-in and fly-outs and the non-regional shareholding of mining companies. Agriculture in particular is unable to compete for labour at the levels paid by the mining industry. Historically, surpluses generated by agriculture mostly leave the outlying regional areas and gravitate to Perth or coastal cities where in general there is less risk and tax-free capital appreciation is much more likely. With a capital gains tax incentive for principal residences, rational economic behaviour causes the movement of capital to these places where there are generally more buoyant and more liquid property prices. Homes built on farm properties rarely add value to the property, a discouragement to make large capital investments in on-property homes. Men and women who seek to make a mainstream contribution have a much higher degree of difficulty than their city counterparts. Extra travel, at all hours of the day and night, unreliable telecommunications, particularly mobile phone coverage, and limitations on health and education. Universal mobile telephone communication and internet access across regional Western Australia should now be considered a basic need. It's the first plank of our health policy. Indeed, it is the first platform of health treatment, security, information and participatory equality with city counterparts. These deficiencies also explain the huge volunteer contribution of citizens living in regional Western Australia. The sum of this regional volunteer contribution would, if calculated, be material, I believe, to the GNP of the state. The third area is crime, the symptom of core social infrastructure deficiency. Petty yet serious crime is endemic in many towns across agricultural regional Western Australia. My experience as a result of extensive door knocking throughout country areas is that the cause is the high level of family dysfunction in many of these towns, both among non-Indigenous and Indigenous families. Typical of these towns is the city of Geraldton and Albany, Narrogin, Mount Barker, Kellerberrin, Moora, Narrogin, and more. Crime is a symptom, not a cause. The cause is much deeper, and the amazing feature of this is that we as a society and previous governments which have meant to act for society have failed to recognise the intimacy of this relationship. People are not born criminals. If it was, we would have to believe that Indigenous people who in Geraldton comprise something like 90-95% of the incarcerated population are born criminals. There is absolutely no foundation for believing this. What we can believe is that they, like their non-Indigenous brothers, do not have the same access to opportunities which many of the rest of us have as a result of the circumstances through which they have grown. We may be born equal of flesh and blood, but we are not born having equal access to opportunities. Each of us in these regional communities share the responsibility for such dysfunction arising. The same could be said for city dysfunction. For the most part up to now, the community has not felt responsible. We have considered it as someone else's problem and often looked too much towards government. The genesis of the solution I outline is bottoms up, from information that surrounds the reality of pressures of everyday living. It will not work if it comes from the top, as it has often in the past, even with the best of intentions. The solution must feel these pressures if it is to make the difference we all believe needs to be made. Individually, we can work hard, but make only a small difference. The whole community must become involved to develop a plan. Police doing very good work comprise only part of the answer. Dealing with this issue across regional Western Australia and Perth demands different approaches in different places. In agricultural terms, it's like the problem our land has with salinity. It is deep and ingrained. One solution does not fit all. Learning continues unmitigated. Different solutions are required for different circumstances, and solutions are difficult to realise. The solution to social dysfunction in the Kimberley will be quite different to the solutions in each of the towns or cities of the agricultural belt of Western Australia, which will be different again to that for Perth. The plan I have in mind has two parts. First, an integrated, comprehensive generational plan with a time horizon of 21 years, commencing the time the child is born. The crucial period of our character formation is the 0 to 7 and 8 years of age. And second, an amelioration plan to deal as best can be done with the community failure we already have and in which we are currently living. For people like me who are beyond 8 years of age and closer to 65, we can only ameliorate their behaviour if it has been affected by family dysfunction, or in any way. The drivers of the plan are threefold. It must be community driven. It must be comprehensive. It must be integrated and tailored to the community characteristics. Therefore, it's got to be developed by the community. It's got to have delegated authority for implementation to the respective local government authorities. And thirdly, funding from the state and Commonwealth, with the state having an audit function from prior to commencing the plan to checking against milestones, because we want to know with the plan, whether we're progressing or whether we're not. This plan will require a unique political time horizon, 21 years. Yet it is crucial, I believe, to the well-being of our society. And I'm already aware there are some measures along this way which are already being implemented, but not comprehensively and not in a delegated way. We already have people in regional Western Australia who have special expertise working with mothers who have children in their formative years, but the new social technology is fighting to be recognised for funding. I contend that such a solution has the capacity of giving a high social and financial return to such government investment to improve our society, increasing respect for our police services and reducing our need for the scale of jails and detention centres currently envisaged. Calculations I have made suggest that for a regional town of around 2,500 people, expenditure of $500,000 to $700,000 per annum under the plan would save explicit and opportunity costs exceeding over $3 million. I do not believe that this one country town's experience to be unique, and the model with adaptation could extend to city communities. What are some of the implementation implications? Leadership of this strategy must come from the local government authority. Ownership of the plan will then be by the community and the local government authority. The plan will have as its foundation platform the provision of social worker, psychologist resources to assist mothers manage their homes and bring up their children during the crucial 0 to 8 years of age, so as to instill into their child the sense to achieve, so that 18 to 21 years, their children will have access to the opportunities which are available to us all. But how useless would it be having resources to assist mothers from the time of their pregnancy or birth of their child to provide a secure emotional upbringing through the crucial 0 to 8 years, if there was not similar attention being given to alcohol control? And I think all alcohol beverages, by the way, should bear labels confirming alcohol is a health hazard. Anger management, drug dependence redirection, employment and long-term unemployment, savings incentives, mothers becoming pregnant at a time when they are too young and do not have sufficient resources to nurture and rear their children. The former federal government's baby bonus, for example, stimulates family dysfunction in low socio-economic areas and needs restructuring. Children born to young women in many regional towns is increasing according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In the lower socio-economic Geraldton suburbs of Rangeway and Spalding especially, but also in Lockyer and Albany. When the issue arose in discussion, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous residents wanted to do away with the baby bonus in its current form. In low socio-economic communities, it leads to young 14 to 16-year-old children, women having children to get the baby bonus. For structural reasons, these families are most prone to becoming dysfunctional. Collectively, many of their children are like a storm cloud on the 10-year horizon as far as juvenile crime and subsequently adult crime is concerned. So what is the biggest impediment? This is highly relevant to each of us here. It is a silo structure, I believe, of our government-managed departments. The plan described here is predicated on cutting across those silo boundaries because without having an integrated, comprehensive, appropriately resourced solution, it will not work. I've already seen signs that the Premier and some public servants are thinking this way. Much of what I am explaining is encapsulated in this following story. The primary school catchment for the Geraldton Senior High School is somewhere around 2,000 Indigenous students. Recent chronology of Indigenous students proceeding through the secondary school years was around 80 in Year 10, 50 in Year 11, 32 in Year 12, but that was the beginning of Year 12. By the end of Year 12, there were 7, and none of those 7 got their TEE. Does this have any linkage to the 90 to 95% Indigenous rate of those incarcerated at the Greenwich Regional Prison? This is a classic example of future crime being the symptom and the social infrastructure being the cause. It will only be when crime becomes sufficiently debilitating for communities that the drive for them to become fully engaged will, I believe, occur. It is a community problem, and we are in a position to help solve it. The fourth issue is government and its involvement in agriculture infrastructure. The major economic activity of the agricultural region electorate is agriculture and its supporting businesses. Of fisheries, forestry and agriculture comprises around 92% of output by value. Government has a distinctive role to assist agriculture and fisheries in a catalytical way with its governance, strategic market structures and eradication of diseases and pests. Agriculture is the home of small business. Economic theory of the firm, as Paul Samuelson taught us in his text, Economics, portrays agriculture as the closest to perfect competition of all industries. Small firms, freely communicated technical information, innovation transparency, nearly always price takers, lacking market differentiation, and having a culture of management independence rather than corporate cooperation. There is no firm that has the power to influence their marketing positioning in perfect competition. Individual firms are just too small to build a sustainable competitive advantage in their markets, especially in bulk agricultural products. Where market differentiation is able to occur, it's precious. Agriculture has always talked of price making to enhance the return to farmers, but rarely achieved it. And when we do, it is often not recognised. I have been involved in both wheat and wool, where market differentiation for the producer has been achieved. The former under a single desk marketing system, and I'm sure I'm going to be have views different to this in this place, with a bulk commodity and integrated paddock to market quality assured system, the latter with a small size specialist developed product where the wool demonstrated superior processing performance. I have directly partaken in selling both wheat and wool into and directly to international markets. The sustainable advantage captured by the marketing of our wheat was undermined when the cooperative structure of its marketing arm was dismembered, commencing in the early 90s. As a dissenting member of the Australian Wheat Board, I opposed in writing the corporatisation model developed by investment bankers with industry leaders naive to its implications at the time. As a consequence, my reappointment soon after was not renewed. Corporatisation, with all its conflicts of interest, was concluded in 1999, with final dismantlement in 2008. The most unfortunate part of this decision was that it was made with naivety and ideology and in the absence of rigorous commercial analysis. Due to lack of funding to bring together the authors of the various reports about single-desk marketing performance, nearly all of which determined it gave value to wheat growers, the differences between them and those who thought it was a disadvantage for wheat growers could not be analysed to find the reality as facts would best allow. A commercial conclusion falling either way could then have been justified. As a consequence, the dismantlement was structurally and politically driven and lacked commercial justification. A government having commercial priorities serving the industry would have acted differently. The wool industry has languished for 40 to 50 years as a result of the vested interests of growers, auction house agents and processors. During the late 80s and early 90s, when the floor price scheme for wool was causing a huge build-up of stocks, all I could hear from ministers and senior public servants was, leadership must come from the industry. The problem here was that the industry did not have the commercial and market sophistication to understand the implications of their inaction. Again, there were not the resources available to fund independent, competent analysis, nor was there catalytic government leadership. I should add that the wool industry, despite being at yet another of its low points, has a future, and I declare an interest here. The solution for wool is simple, with two parts. Develop a fibre-specific brand strategy, especially one which focuses on next to the skin wear. And secondly, a value chain quality assurance along one of the longest value chains of any industry in the world. The brand strategy will require investment. The quality assurance will be cheap to implement and be effective. And as an aside, the industry must cease musing, in my view. The debate is a current market distraction to the main marketing game. But each of the wheat and wool cases are similar, though not the same. The similarity is that rigorous independent examination was either not sought or could not be afforded. A few voices making loud rhetoric, aided by the press, had the superior impact, together with some fortunate political timing that could win the day. The critical analysis fell short. The truth was not pursued to the point that it yielded a non-ideological commercial solution. Funds to pay for independent analysis were not forthcoming. Catalytic leadership from government was absent. The agricultural constituency was rendered ill-informed. There was no plebiscite process by which the industry could elect options for action. Politics took over commercial decision-making. It is the classic case of a good scorer winning the day over a good player. These cases exemplify the core issue facing agricultural production. A major problem is not with production. What we are foregoing is the value adding arising from poor strategic thinking beyond production. All the hard work of farmers is often being sold short. Even with arguably the best production technology in the world, it is its governance and strategic market infrastructure which makes the productivity gap. On the extreme contra end, governments spend enormous sums investigating the industry structure and governance of the banking system and financial industry. The banking system in the Western world is made up of relatively few big players. It's quite different to agriculture. Australia has shown outstanding leadership, distinct from the USA, directing governance of the banking system. The Australian model needs to be followed by government for the agricultural industry, although not so much directing, but just having a catalytical role. And when I say catalytical role, what I mean is that like a chemical reaction, where there is a catalyst which assists two parts to react, such that governments can then assist the evolution of key decisions. Only then will the potential of agriculture be released and be made more attractive for young people to enter. I know that governance and strategic marketing excellence in agriculture can be achieved. The US cotton industry achieved strategic marketing excellence when it restored the proportion of cotton in US apparel from around 35% in 1975 to 60% in 1990, as recounted in the book Cotton's Renaissance, a study in market innovation by Jacobson and Smith, 2001. If US cotton can turn itself around, so can Australia with its wool and other products. Similar governance deficient remarks can be made with reference to the two agro-political farming organisations operating in Western Australia and federally with respect to the National Farmers Federation. It has been damaging to the state, in my view. As with the situation to which I referred earlier, industries with larger firms have been more able to get their governance together. Look at the professional organisation, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Western Australia, and the influence it has with government. All three of these agricultural organisations do not have the financial strength to hire or contract the resources to provide such analytical rigour for the key commercial decisions that need to be made for their industry. Catalytic leadership from government is similarly important to assist agriculture's engagement with nature. Nature is unrelenting. It adapts at a much faster rate than we humans, especially farming humans, can. Tragically, much of the agricultural region has been contaminated by the introduction of pests, diseases, plants and viruses. Almost without exception, these have been introduced from environments foreign to Australia, and in particular Western Australia, with the wonderful natural protection which has been given by the Nullarbor Plain for so long. Introduction of these pests were largely decisions or practices made by the society of the day. Parliamentarians through the measures which they sanctioned, and people's willingness to accept foreign plants and animals into our land which were not sufficiently well researched prior to their local adoption. Agriculture faces a similar threat from society with the potential introduction of the genetically modified Roundup Ready, which is glyphosate resistant, cropping grain plants. GMO technology and its use in Western Australia is important. However, growing the Roundup Ready GMO plants, crop plants where the glyphosate chemical can be used to kill weeds, but not the canola or other grain plants, which have been bred to be resistant to the only knockdown chemical available to farmers, places grain growers at even more acute risk of weed resistance. Western Australia is already the world's capital for crop weed resistance. The world's capital. Once a glyphosate-resistant weed crosses into a paddock, the whole paddock will become resistant to glyphosate within around 5 years. Roundup Ready grain crops should not be commercially grown, in my view, until we have a fallback position for glyphosate. Controlling serious diseases and pests in Western Australia in our agriculture has been tried with one hand tied behind the back at expense to the taxpayer. The measures failed because they employed encouragement incentives only. This is not enough. Like nearly all policy measures, eradication of pest regimes such as foot rot, lice, Johne's disease, caltrop, double G, Patterson's curse, skeleton weed requires a package of elements. The carrot approach needs to be joined with the stick approach. I mean heavy fines for non-compliance and with complementary levies applied as appropriate. Remember, agriculture comprises the largest small business sector in the state. Most of these hold their independence dearly. Most care deeply about the long-term condition of their land. And most have a planning time horizon of 5 to 20 years. However, there are some who have little regard for the broader implications of their behaviour. This small group can wreak potentially damaging changes when passionately pursuing their short-term causes for their own agendas. Unlike an industry of few large corporations, small business needs a mechanism which can give it the template for industry ownership of solutions, given that informed quality critical analysis is provided. Government has a role to assist small business in gaining mechanisms of countervailing commercial power, following the process of critical analysis on any material issue, be it governance, marketing or pest related. There is a simple mechanism, in my view, for an affected industry segment or area facing these serious issues. It is an electronic plebiscite system, where a predetermined majority, be it 50, 60 or 75%, is applied. Only a template of this kind will reflect the industry, commercial and governance desires. And finally, the final topic, climate dynamics. The climate debate is being pilloried in the same way as religion. I remain intrigued how our most forceful disagreements about issues as significant as religion and climate change, which cannot be 100% proven, or we believe what we want to believe regardless of the best knowledge of the time. To recount briefly, and forgive me if you are already well familiar with this detail, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was set up by the World Meteorological Organisation and the United Nations Environmental Programme, and recognises the vast complexities and balances of probability in reaching its conclusions, and that's important. It bases its assessments mainly on published and peer-reviewed scientific and technical literature. IPCC's bad news is that in its 2007 report, it's barely 2 years ago, confirmed, quote, warming of the climate system is unequivocal, unquote. These are very strong words. Of the more than 29,000 observational data series from 75 studies that show significant change in many physical and biological systems, 89% are consistent with the direction of change expected as a response to warming. And worse, quote, there is a very high confidence, and they define very high confidence as a chance of 9 out of 10, that the net effect of human activity since 1750 has been one of warming. Most of the observed increases in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely, which they define as greater than 90% chance, very likely, due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, concentrations, unquote. And quote again, CO2 is the most important anthropogenic greenhouse gas, unquote. Its, quote, annual emissions grew by about 80% between 1970 and 2004, unquote. And CO2 from fossil fuel use comprises 59% of the total greenhouse gas emissions over this period. Further, the IPCC claims that during the past 50 years, the sum of solar and volcanic forcings would likely, and that's greater than a 66% chance, have produced cooling. And that's something I didn't realise. It is the rate of change which is the most threatening. Intuitively, it makes sense. It took millions of years for forests to underground carbon sinks. We are concentrating these millions of years into a few hundred as we draw on these sinks and exhume resulting carbon dioxide into the air. We all know that there is the opposing view that there is no global warming, or it's the climate variation that we have always known, which most of us farmers mostly believe, or that it has nothing to do with human behaviour. Professor Plamer's best-selling book is the most recent. As a book reviewer said only last Saturday on Radio National's book review program, Professor Plamer's unmarked sources for his tables, inconsistencies and lack of substance for his various claims renders his book meaningless for the true debate on climate change. And I found it quite easy to believe Plamer's findings. There have been others. The public needs to be vigilant. In a recent assessment, regrettably I've misplaced this source, of the for and against climate change publications in US newspapers, it was revealed that the number of reports was 50-50 for and against. But whereas the pro-climate change nearly all had peer reviews of their scientific papers, there were barely any of the against which had such peer reviews. Now, peer review is the academic time-honoured way of preserving the veracity of scientific conclusions over rhetoric, yet it seems sadly forgotten in the climate change debate. May I put it to you this way? Would any of us board an aeroplane if there was a 9 out of 10 chance of mechanical failure that would cause it to crash? Would any of us eat food where there was a 9 out of 10 chance that it had been shown to potentially kill us? Would any of us place our entire net savings into a business where it had a 9 out of 10 chance of totally failing? I contend that each of us would answer each of these questions, no. So the first consideration of climate change is risk management. Given the unequivocal chance of global warming occurring and the 90% chance that it results from greenhouse gas emissions, and that 59% of greenhouse gas emissions comprise carbon dioxide released from fossil fuels, are we really willing to sit back and do nothing on the basis that it is either not happening, or if it is happening, that it's not us? Or do we accept that the do-nothing option is too big a risk? My view is that it is too big a risk for us to ignore. We will have to act in the belief that human activity is the main cause of climate change and global warming. For those who insist on not tackling climate change until it is 100% proven that it is a result of human behaviour rather than sunspots or other solar forces, they are taking an unconscionable risk. If in 20 to 30 years' time it confirms that it is us, then it will be too late. So late that a turnaround will have the most extreme economic consequences, far beyond those which the world economy has ever experienced. If CO2 emissions are not the cause, we can always unwind the climate abatement measures without irreversible cost. The second consideration is agriculture. Agriculture is yet to be understood by the former Kyoto architects, in particular the carbon cycle and soil carbon. Soil carbon, following research into lower cost measurement techniques, will take on a new role, as will the value of on-farm trees such as oil mallees, new perennial species on which Australian plant research is just beginning, and methane-reducing microflora for ruminants such as cattle and sheep. All it needs is a carbon price at a level to make this commercial, and I have done some of this work. It's got to be somewhere around $40 to $50 per tonne of CO2 equivalent. Those of us in agriculture and other industries who move first are the ones who are going to apply them to our own environments and new businesses and industries around them. My goal is that all fossil fuels and other costs should be priced to reflect their true cost. We need to accept also that global warming mitigation is going to cost us all initially. Australia must be sufficiently brave to lead with climate change mitigating strategies. Others will quickly follow. We must get an emissions trading scheme that can generate a carbon price as soon as possible. Finally, with respect to an emission trading scheme, the greatest fault with the federal government scheme is that the government is not putting us as citizens sufficiently in touch with it, in my view. It is a big business show at this stage. An emissions trading scheme has to be both an household and business show, and I think it's so easy to do. I feel that every business and household should be required to calculate their carbon footprint once per year, like filling out an income tax return, with a tax equivalent booklet showing a carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for outputs we consume based on the science of the day. There'll be some GST kind of equivalent stuff in this as well. But at the same time, the government determines the carbon emission target reduction level to which we must conform by the specified time period. The resulting net carbon credits and deficits of each household and business, together with the carbon reduction target set by government, will immediately generate a market and carbon price. It will also stimulate innovation. The carbon permit auctions, protection of low-income households, carbon pollution reduction scheme mechanisms can all still operate within this template. The difference is that all households and businesses drive the emissions reduction. The carbon reducing culture will quickly become deeply ingrained into society. From the current situation of greenhouse gas emissions tracking the IPCC's worst case scenarios of increasing carbon dioxide equivalent emissions every year, we will turn it around to greenhouse gas emissions decreasing every year, the objective of Ms Penny Sackett, Australia's chief scientist. But regional Western Australia has one of the greatest resources of reliable sunlight, wind, wave and geothermal capacity and proximity to functional towns of anywhere in the country and possibly the world. It won't take much to make these sources baseload relevant. Solar power in either its photovoltaic or reflective mirror technology fits into adding baseload capacity by storing the resulting steam from daylight generation, for example, into geothermal bores, from where it can be released and drive turbines during the night. Regional towns are largely aware of the potential they hold. It is waiting for government to recognise the value and opportunity. There are many opportunities for agriculture and the agricultural region, with the only condition that where carbon is unable to be measured, those elements for agriculture should be excluded until measurement can be defined. You'll be pleased, I'm in my last paragraph. Not quite the last paragraph, last page. We can make the world a better place for mankind. outstanding leadership of the Barack Obama kind and what we have here in Western Australia will be required at the top. But to the lowest, we each have the actual or latent capacity for degrees of leadership within our immediate community sphere. Like the amount and colour of the hair on my head, I reflect those around me and those who preceded me. They may not always have endorsed or agreed with me. That is where I would have taken over. To my wonderful, courageous and strong wife Jenny, and similarly our two sons Charles with his wife Natasha and their son Lucas, working in human resources consultancy in Melbourne, and James trading bullion and playing both his football and piano in Sydney, they sustain my inspiration. To my late father and mother, who at 91 is unable to make this evening as she did the induction, I thank them for never displaying any expectation, but giving me the unconditional love that gives the foundation of emotional security and the example of capacity for work with little complaint. And to my dear brother Colin and his wife and family for their sustained support. To our close friends who helped counsel me on this career change, notably A.C. Chowdhury, my wonderful friend of India, David Hutt, our English brother-in-law, the Honourable Wendy Duncan, and especially Brendan Grills, together with those serving in this house and the other place, who have got me here despite myself. Thank you. I very much look forward to serving with each of you to advance the interests of the people of Western Australia and Australia. Thank you very much.